Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the shadows of history. Tonight, we invite you to settle back, perhaps pull a soft blanket closer, okay, and allow your mind to drift into the sun-baked villages and mud-brick homes of ancient Egypt. You are safe here, in your comfortable present, wrapped in the certainty of modern nutrition and dental care. As we explore a time when every meal came with a price your teeth would pay, the ancient Egyptians, for all their monumental achievements and sophisticated civilization, lived with a constant companion at every meal: sand, fine particles of stone dust that ground away at their molars with each bite, each sip, each attempt to sustain life along the fertile banks of the Nile. Tonight, we will walk in their sandals, feel the grit between our teeth, and discover why the simple act of eating was both a blessing and a burden in the land of the pharaohs. If you want to help me to keep doing these videos, please consider subscribing to the channel and hit the like button. It motivates and helps me keep bringing videos in this format. If you'd like to hear about a specific topic, leave a comment below, and I'll show you in the video when your topic is chosen. Imagine yourself awakening as the first pale light creeps across the eastern horizon, painting the mud brick walls of your small dwelling in shades of amber and gold. The air is already warm, carrying with it the familiar sense of the Nile, that eternal river whose waters have blessed and cursed Egypt since time immemorial. Your stomach contracts with hunger, that gnawing companion that begins each day with its insistent reminder of mortality. But before you can break your fast, there is work to be done. The grain must be ground, the bread must be made, and the ancient ritual of survival must begin anew. You rise from your simple reed mat, your joints protesting the hardness of the floor, and make your way to the corner where your most precious possessions wait. Here sits your quern, that essential tool of civilization. It's two circular stones that will transform the hard kernels of emmer wheat into something approaching food. The lower stone, called the saddle quern, has been worn smooth by countless generations of use, its surface polished by the endless grinding of grain against stone. The upper stone, smaller and more manageable, fits comfortably in your weathered hands, though you know that by day's end, those same hands will be raw and aching from the repetitive motion of survival. The more wheat you pour, cone to the lower stone, is precious beyond measure, each golden kernel representing security against the hunger that stalks the land like a patient predator. This ancient grain, harder and more resilient than its modern descendants, requires enormous effort to transform into flour. You begin the rhythmic motion that has defined human civilization for millennia, rolling the upper stone back and forth across the grain, applying steady pressure that gradually crushes the stubborn kernels into submission. The sound is hypnotic, a grinding whisper that speaks of patience and necessity, of the eternal struggle between human need and the reluctant generosity of nature. But with each pass of the stone, something else joins the flour. Tiny particles of granite and sandstone, worn away by the friction of stone against stone, mixed invisibly with your precious grain. This contamination is not an accident or a sign of poor craftsmanship. It is the inevitable price of sustenance, the tax that every meal demands of your teeth and jaw. The grinding continues, and with it, the gradual transformation of stone into powder, of necessity into sustenance, of survival into the promise of another day. As you work, the rhythmic motion becomes almost meditative, your mind drifting to other mornings, other meals, other times when this same ancient dance was performed by your mother, your grandmother, and countless women, stretching back to the very dawn of Egyptian civilization. Your arms burn with the familiar ache of effort, sweat beading on your forehead despite the early hour. But still, you continue. There is no choice in this matter, no alternative to the grinding, no escape from the daily communion with stone and grain that defines existence along the Nile. The flour that emerges from your quern is coarse and gritty, nothing like the refined powder that modern minds might imagine. It is pale brown in color, flecked with darker fragments that speak of its humble origins. And when you run it between your fingers, you can feel the sharp edges of stone dust that have become an integral part of your daily bread. This is not a defect to be corrected, but a reality to be accepted, as natural and inevitable as the rising of the sun or the flooding of the Nile. With your precious flour finally prepared, you turn your attention to the next stage of this morning ritual. The fire must be coaxed to life, a delicate negotiation with flame and fuel that requires both skill and patience. You arrange the dry dung and straw with practiced efficiency, each piece placed with the knowledge that comes from countless repetitions of this same task. The tinder catches with a satisfying whisper, growing from spark to flame with the enthusiasm of life itself. Soon, the fire burns steady and hot, ready to transform your gritty flour into something approaching nourishment. The bread you will make is not the leavened loaves of more prosperous times and places, but flat, dense discs that cook quickly and require no precious yeast. You mix your flour with water drawn from the nearby canal, that life-giving liquid that carries within it the silt and minerals of the great river. The resulting dough is heavy in your hands, coarse and unyielding, resistant to your efforts to work it into something resembling bread. But you persist, kneading and folding, adding water when the mixture becomes too dry, sprinkling flour when it grows too wet, searching for that perfect balance that will yield sustenance rather than failure. As you work the dough, you can feel the grit within it, those countless particles of stone that will soon become part of your body, grinding against your teeth and wearing away the enamel that protects them. This is not malice on the part of nature or failure on your part, but simply the way things are. The price that must be paid for the privilege of continued existence. Your ancestors accepted this bargain, as did their ancestors before them, stretching back through the dynasties to the very beginning of human settlement in this blessed and cursed land. Your first meal of the day begins with the ritual tearing of bread, those flat, dense cakes that emerge from your makeshift oven, still warm and fragrant with the smell of baking grain. The texture is immediately apparent as your teeth sink into the coarse surface, that familiar grittiness that speaks of stone and survival, of the eternal bargain between sustenance and suffering that defines existence along the Nile. Each bite requires careful chewing, not for pleasure or flavor, but to break down the tough fibers and hard particles that make up this basic food. The sensation is one that would horrify modern sensibilities, that grinding feeling of stone against enamel, the way the bread seems to fight back against your efforts to consume it. But you have known no other way, in your teeth, still already showing the wear and damage that marks every adult Egyptian, continue their appointed task with the resignation of long practice. You wash down each mouthful with sips of thick beer, the liquid helping to soften the bread and ease its passage down your throat as you eat. You might think of the day ahead, of the work that must be done, of the endless cycle of grinding and baking and brewing that fills your days and defines your existence. But there's also satisfaction in this morning ritual, the deep contentment that comes from having food to eat, water to drink, and shelter from the burning sun that will soon transform the landscape into a furnace of heat and light. The sun climbs higher now, its rays slanting through the small window of your dwelling and illuminating the dust motes that dance eternally in the Egyptian air. These same particles that float so gracefully in the morning light will soon settle on your food, adding yet another layer to the gritty texture that defines every meal in this ancient land. You have finished your morning bread and beer, but the day's eating has only just begun, and with it, the constant negotiation between nourishment and the slow destruction of your teeth. Your next task takes you beyond the confines of your home, out into the bustling world of the village market, where the day's fresh provisions await those with the means to purchase them. The streets are narrow and winding, packed earth that has been compressed by countless feet over countless generations. As you walk, the dust rises around your sandaled feet, creating small clouds that settle on your clothing, your skin, and inevitably, the food that vendors display on reed mats and in shallow baskets. The market is a symphony of sights and sounds and smells that speak of life and commerce and the eternal human struggle to transform the raw materials of existence into something approaching comfort. Here, fishermen from the Nile displayed their catch on beds of reeds, the silver scales glinting in the morning sun, the flesh still firm despite the heat that is already beginning to build. But these fish, precious as they are, carry their own burden of grit and sand. Caught as they were in the murky waters of the great river, their flesh inevitably contaminated with the fine silt that the Nile carries in its eternal journey to the sea. You approach the fish vendor with the careful calculation that marks all transactions in this world of scarcity and want. Fresh fish is a luxury that few can afford on a daily basis, but occasionally, when the catch has been particularly good, or when some small prosperity has blessed your household, you might purchase a small specimen to supplement your diet of bread and beer. The fish you select is modest in size, its scales dulled by the dust of the marketplace, its eyes clouded by the heat and the passage of time since its capture. The cleaning process is meticulous, but can never be complete. No matter how carefully you scrape and rinse, traces of grit remain embedded in the flesh, caught in the natural crevices and textures of the fish's body. This is not failure on your part, but simply the reality of life along a river that carries the erosion of an entire continent in its waters. The Nile gives life, but it gives it at a price, and that price is measured in the gradual wearing away of teeth and jaw, and the patient erosion of human health. You prepare a simple fire in your courtyard, arranging dried palm fronds and dung with the practiced efficiency of long experience. The flames catch quickly in the dry air, sending up thin streams of smoke that carried the familiar sense of home and hearth and the eternal human struggle to transform raw materials into nourishment. The fish, wrapped in broad leaves from the date palm, goes onto the coals to cook slowly in its own juices, the heat gradually penetrating the flesh and transforming it from raw river creature into something approaching food. While the fish cooks, you turn your attention to the other elements of your midday meal. Onions, those pungent bulbs that grow so readily in the rich soil of the Nile Delta, must be prepared for eating. These humble vegetables, prized for their ability to flavor the otherwise bland diet of bread and grain, carry their own burden of earth and grit. No matter how carefully they are cleaned, traces of the soil in which they grew remain trapped between their layers, adding yet another textural element to the complex symphony of grit that defines Egyptian cuisine. You peel away the papery outer layers of the onions, revealing the white flesh beneath, but with each layer removed, more evidence of the earth's presence becomes apparent. Small particles of sand and clay cling stubbornly to the vegetable's surface, worked into the very structure of the plant by wind and rain and the natural processes of growth. These particles cannot be removed by simple washing, for they have become part of the onion itself, integrated into its cellular structure through the slow alchemy of agriculture. The onions go into a shallow pottery bowl, their sharp aroma beginning to fill the air as you crush them with a wooden pestle. The crushing action releases not only the characteristic scent and flavor of the vegetable, but also the grit that has become part of its essence. With each blow of the pestle, more particles of earth are liberated from their vegetable prison, mixing with the onion's juices to create a paste that is both flavorful and inevitably sandy. Your pottery bowl, like all vessels in ancient Egypt, bears the marks of its manufacture. The slight irregularities and rough patches that speak of human hands shaping clay on a potter's wheel. These imperfections, invisible to the casual glance, become apparent when food is prepared and served, as tiny fragments of fired clay mingle with the meal, adding their own contribution to the abrasive symphony that accompanies every bite. The fish, when finally cooked, emerges from its leaf wrapping fragrant with smoke and herbs, its flesh flaking away from the bones in tender steaming portions. But with the first bite, the familiar sensation returns. That grinding texture that speaks of river silt and market dust, and the inevitable contamination that marks all food in this land of sand and wind. The flesh of the fish, tender as it may be, carries within it the story of its life in the muddy waters of the Nile. The microscopic particles of granite and limestone that the great river has carried from the mountains of Ethiopia and the deserts of the south. You eat slowly, savoring the luxury of fresh fish while simultaneously negotiating the challenges it presents to your teeth and jaw. Each bite requires careful chewing, not only to release the fish's flavor, but to break down the small bones and scales and grit that inevitably accompany the flesh. Your molars work methodically, grinding not only organic matter, but the mineral components that have become inseparable from your food, slowly wearing away the enamel that protects them, and hastening the day when tooth loss will force you to rely entirely on softer foods. The onions provide a sharp counterpoint to the fish's mild flavor, their pungent oils burning pleasantly on your tongue, while their gritty texture adds yet another layer to the complex sensory experience of eating in ancient Egypt. You wash each mouthful down with more of the thick beer, its yeasty flavor and slightly alcoholic content helping to dull the constant awareness of the sand between your teeth as the meal progresses. You become aware of the rhythm that governs all eating in your world, the careful balance between the desire for nourishment and the need to protect what remains of your dental health. You eat enough to satisfy hunger, but not so much as to cause unnecessary damage. Calculating with each bite the cost in tooth wear against the benefit in nutrition. This is a mathematics of survival that every Egyptian understands instinctively, a complex equation that weighs immediate need against future consequences. Your evening meal will be simpler, perhaps more bread with a paste made from ground seeds or dried fish, accompanied by more beer and whatever vegetables might be available from your small garden plot. The rhythm of eating continues, that steady grinding of teeth against grit, the patient work of survival that marks every day of Egyptian life. You know that each meal brings you closer to the day when your teeth will no longer serve you, when the accumulated damage of a lifetime of sandy food will force you to change your diet and your relationship with nourishment. But this knowledge brings no despair, for it is simply the way of things. As natural and inevitable as the flooding of the Nile or the movement of the stars across the night sky, your ancestors lived with this same burden, as will your children and their children after them, until perhaps some distant future brings different ways of preparing food and preserving teeth. For now, there is only the present moment, the satisfaction of hunger appeased, and the quiet contentment that comes from another successful negotiation with the demands of survival in this ancient and unforgiving land. As the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that have remained unchanged since the very dawn of human civilization, the rhythms of daily sustenance continue their ancient dance. The heat of midday is slowly giving way to the more gentle warmth of evening, though the air still shimmers with the accumulated warmth of another day in the desert kingdom. This is the time when families gather for their final meal of the day, when the work of survival pauses briefly to allow for the simple pleasure of shared nourishment and the quiet satisfaction that comes from having successfully navigated another day along the banks of the eternal Nile. Your evening preparations begin as they have for countless generations before you, with the familiar ritual of grinding grain. The emmer wheat that will become your evening bread has been soaking in precious water since the morning, a process that softens the hard kernels slightly, but can never eliminate the fundamental challenge they present to human teeth and digestive systems. You pour the soaked grain onto your well-worn quern, the stone surface still bearing the marks of the morning's work, the accumulated deposits of flour and stone dust that speak of the endless cycle of preparation and consumption that defines existence. In this ancient land, the evening grinding has a different quality from the urgent work of morning, a more meditative rhythm that speaks of the day's accomplishments and the promise of rest to come. Your movements are slower now, more deliberate, as if the accumulated fatigue of the day has settled into your bones and muscles, making each motion a conscious choice rather than an automatic response to necessity. The sound of stone against stone takes on an almost musical quality in the cooling air, a percussion that speaks of human persistence and the eternal struggle to transform the raw materials of nature into something approaching sustenance. Your evening bread dough takes shape under your hands with the familiar resistance that marks all such preparations in your world. The mixture reluctant to bind together, the gritty texture a constant reminder of the compromises that survival demands. You knead the dough with practiced efficiency, your palms and fingers working the stubborn mixture until it achieves some semblance of cohesion, though it would never approach the smooth, elastic quality that would mark properly refined flour. Each fold and press of the dough releases more particles of stone dust, the mechanical action breaking down the larger fragments into ever smaller pieces that will distribute themselves throughout the finished bread like tiny, edible jewels. The fire you build for your evening cooking burns with the same materials that have fueled Egyptian households since the beginning of recorded history. Dried palm fronds and animal dung arranged with a skill that comes from a lifetime of practice. The flames catch quickly in the dry air, their light beginning to compete with the fading illumination of the setting sun, creating a warm glow that transforms your simple courtyard into a space of comfort and security. The smoke that rises from your fire carries with it the familiar sense of home and hearth, but also the fine particles of ash and dust that will inevitably settle on your food, adding yet another layer to the complex texture that defines every meal in this ancient land. As your bread cooks on the heated stones that serve as your oven, you turn your attention to the other elements of your evening meal. The dried fish that hangs in strips from the rafters of your dwelling represents the preservation of river bounty against the lean times that periodically visit even the most fertile regions of Egypt. These desiccated remnants of former aquatic life have been cured in salt and dried in the desert air until they achieve a consistency somewhere between leather and wood. Their flesh transformed into something that can survive the heat and humidity of the Egyptian climate without spoiling. The preparation of dried fish for consumption is an art that requires both patience and strong teeth, for the preservation process that allows the fish to keep for months also renders it nearly impervious to normal chewing. You must first soak the dried strips in water, allowing the desiccated flesh to slowly absorb moisture and achieve something approaching edibility. But even this softening process cannot eliminate the concentrated grit and salt that have become integral parts of the preserved meat. The mineral residue of the Nile's waters concentrated and intensified by the drying process. The soaked fish, when finally ready for consumption, tears apart into stringy fibers that speak of the violence done to its original texture by salt and sun and time. Each piece carries with it not only the concentrated flavor of the river, but also the accumulated grit of its preservation. Tiny crystals of salt, mixed with particles of sand and silt that have become as much a part of the food as the fish flesh itself. You chew each morsel carefully, your teeth working to break down not only the tough protein fibers, but also the mineral components that have become inseparable from the preserved meat. The vegetables that accompany your evening meal come from the small garden plot that you tend behind your dwelling, a patch of ground that represents both the fertility of the Nile Delta and the endless struggle to maintain cultivation in a land where sand and sun conspire against all growing things. The onions and leeks that you harvest in the cooling evening air carry with them not only the sharp flavors that will enliven your simple meal, but also the inevitable burden of soil and grit that marks all agricultural products In this dusty kingdom, even the most careful washing cannot completely remove the earth that clings to these humble vegetables. For the sand of Egypt has a way of working itself into every crevice and fold of plant matter, becoming integrated into the very structure of the food through the natural processes of growth and cultivation. The irrigation water that nourishes your garden carries with it the same burden of silt and mineral particles that characterizes all water in Egypt, so that even the act of cleaning your vegetables serves only to replace one type of contamination with another. The meal that emerges from your evening preparations is simple but satisfying, a combination of bread and preserved fish and fresh vegetables that speaks of the river's bounty and the human ingenuity that has learned to transform its gifts into sustenance. But with the first bite, the familiar sensation returns, that grinding texture that has become as much a part of eating as flavor or satisfaction. Your teeth encounter not only the food itself, but the inevitable mineral components that have become inseparable from every element of your diet. The bread tears apart under your teeth with the characteristic resistance, of course, flour and imperfect grinding. Its dense texture, studded with particles of stone dust that create small explosions of grit with each bite. You have long since ceased to notice these sensations as anything unusual or unpleasant, for they have become simply part of the experience of eating, as natural and expected as the taste of grain or the satisfaction of hunger appeased. Your molars work methodically, grinding not only organic matter, but the mineral fragments that have become integrated into your food through the inevitable processes of preparation and preservation. The preserved fish provides a different but equally challenging texture. Its concentrated flavors, accompanied by the sharp crystals of salt and the accumulated grit of its preservation process. Each strand of fish meat must be chewed carefully and thoroughly, not only to release its nourishment, but to break down the mineral components that threaten to damage your teeth if swallowed whole. The process is slow and deliberate, a meditation on the nature of survival and the prices that must be paid for the privilege of continued existence in this harsh but beautiful land. As you eat, the light continues to fade from the western sky, the last rays of the sun painting the walls of your dwelling in shades of gold and amber that speak of the eternal cycle of day and night governs all life along the Nile. The air begins to cool slightly, bring with it the promise of respite from the heat that has dominated the day, though the stones of your courtyard will continue to radiate warmth long into the night. This is the time of day when the grinding of teeth against grit takes on an almost meditative quality, the rhythm of chewing becoming a percussion that marks the passage of time and the steady accumulation of another day's worth of dentalware. Your beer, when you raise the bowl to your lips, carries with it the familiar turbidity that marks all fermented beverages in your world, the suspension of grain particles and yeast, creating a liquid that is as much food as drink. The fermentation process has transformed the raw materials into something that can sustain life and provide the calories necessary for survival. But it cannot eliminate the fundamental grittiness that characterizes all products of stone-ground grain. With each swallow, you feel the familiar sensation of particles settling between your teeth, finding their way into every gap and crevice, adding to the accumulated abrasion that marks each day's passage through the medium of dentalware. The evening meal concludes, as it began, with the quiet satisfaction that comes from successful nourishment, and the knowledge that another day's challenges have been met and overcome. Your teeth bear the evidence of this success in the form of additional wear in the accumulated deposits of stone, dust that no amount of cleaning can completely remove. This is not failure, but simply the natural consequence of existence in a world where survival depends on the patient grinding of stone against stone, grain against teeth, life against the inexorable forces of time and change. As you clean your simple pottery bowls with sand and water, the abrasive action of the cleaning process adds its own contribution to the wear patterns that mark all household implements in ancient Egypt. The pottery, like your teeth, bears the accumulated evidence of countless meals and countless cleanings. Its surface, gradually abraded by the same forces that work upon your body. The sand that you use for cleaning is not a foreign contaminant, but simply another manifestation of the environment that shapes all aspects of life in this desert kingdom. The same mineral particles that flavor your food and wear your teeth also serving the practical function of cleaning your household implements. Let us now turn our attention from the daily grinding of survival to a man whose life revolved around ensuring that such survival remained possible for thousands of others. Imagine yourself as King Wasit, a middle-ranking official in the service of Pharaoh Ramesses II, Kea, blessed with the title of overseer of the royal granaries in the Nome of Memphis. Your world is one of numbers and calculations, of grain stores and distribution lists, of the delicate balance between abundance and famine that determines whether the people of Egypt will continue to grind their daily bread or perish in the desert sands that surround their fertile kingdom. The year is one of particular anxiety, when the great Nile has failed to achieve its usual heights during the annual flood, leaving vast stretches of agricultural land only partially irrigated and the harvest reduced to perhaps 60% of its normal abundance. This is not yet famine, not the terrible specter that haunts Egyptian nightmares and reduces entire populations to skeletal rates, begging for grain. But it is enough to transform your comfortable administrative duties into a burden that weighs upon your shoulders like the stones of a pyramid under construction. Your calculations must also account for the inevitable wastage that accompanies any system of grain storage and distribution, the portions lost to rodents and insects, and the simple deterioration that affects all organic matter in the heat and humidity of the Egyptian climate. The granaries themselves, massive structures built of mud, brick, and stone, provide excellent protection against most threats to the stored grain, but they cannot eliminate the slow but constant loss that represents perhaps 10% of your total stores over the course of a year. The grain that fills your warehouses carries with it the same burden of grit and contamination that marks all agricultural products in Egypt, the inevitable result of harvesting and processing methods that have changed little since the earliest dynasties. The emor wheat and barley that represent your kingdom's lifeline have been threshed on floors of packed earth, winnowed in the desert wind that carries sand and dust in constant suspension, and ground in stone querns that add their own mineral contribution to the final product. Your responsibility extends beyond mere calculation and record keeping to the actual supervision of distribution, a process that brings you into direct contact with the human faces behind the numbers in your scrolls. Each morning, long lines of workers and their families form outside the granary buildings, men and women whose bodies already show the effects of reduced rations and increased physical demands, their faces weathered by sun and wind and the constant struggle for survival, bear expressions of patient resignation, mixed with the anxiety that comes from uncertainty about the future. The distribution process itself is a carefully choreographed ritual that has been refined over centuries of practice, designed to ensure fairness while preventing the chaos that could result from uncontrolled access to the grain stores. Each family group approaches the distribution point in turn, their entitlement determined by the nature and importance of their work, their status within the community, and the number of dependents they must support. The grain they receive has been measured with precision using standard containers. Its capacity has been verified by temple authorities. But even this careful measurement cannot eliminate the variability that results from the different densities and textures of various grain types. The workers who receive their daily rations examine each portion with the intensity of those whose survival depends on accurate assessment. their experienced eyes evaluating not only the quantity but also the quality of the grain they receive. They look for signs of spoilage or excessive contamination. Though they understand that some degree of grit and debris is simply an unavoidable part of their allotment, their acceptance of these imperfections speaks not of low standards, but of practical wisdom, the understanding that perfect grain is a luxury that exists only in the dreams of those who do not face the daily reality of potential starvation. As you oversee this process, you become acutely aware of the weight of your decisions and the impact they will have on thousands of lives. The reduction in rations that mathematical necessity demands will translate directly into increased hunger, weakened immune systems, and the slow but steady deterioration of the physical and mental capacity that allows these people to perform the labor that sustains Egyptian civilization. Each basket of grain that you withhold from current distribution represents a gamble that future harvests will be more generous, that the Nile will return to its normal patterns of flooding, and that the kingdom will survive long enough to benefit from these conservative policies. Your own meals, taken in the privacy of your limestone dwelling, provide a stark contrast to the reduced rations that you oversee in the granaries. As a high-ranking official, you have access to foods that remain beyond the reach of ordinary workers, even in times of abundance. Delicacies that speak of trade networks stretching across the known world and the privileges that accompany administrative responsibility. Yet even your elevated status cannot completely insulate you from the fundamental realities of Egyptian cuisine, the unavoidable presence of grit and contamination that marks all food preparation in this desert kingdom. The bread that graces your table is made from finer flour than what reaches the common people, the grain having been sifted through cloth screens that remove the largest particles of stone and debris. But this refinement process, while reducing the most obvious contamination, cannot eliminate the microscopic particles that have become integrated into the flour through the grinding process itself. Your teeth, though they may last longer than those of workers who consume coarser food, still bear the accumulated evidence of a lifetime of meals flavored with the taste of stone and sand. Your fellow administrators share stories and strategies from their own domains, describing experiments with different distribution methods and alternative approaches to maintaining nutrition while reducing consumption. Some have attempted to extend grain supplies by increasing the proportion of chaff and other normally discarded materials in the flour distributed to workers, creating a product that is even more challenging to teeth and digestive systems, but provides additional bulk and some nutritional value. Others have explored the possibility of organized foraging expeditions to collect wild plants and seeds that might supplement the official rations. The reports that reach you from other administrative districts paint a picture of a kingdom under strain but not yet in crisis, of populations that have tightened their belts but not yet reached the point of desperation that would threaten social stability. The reduced rations have been accepted with the stoic resignation that characterizes the Egyptian response to hardship, the understanding that survival often requires sacrifice and that temporary hunger is preferable to the chaos that would result from social collapse. Your sleep, when it finally comes after long hours of calculation and consultation, is often disturbed by dreams that blend the abstract numbers of your administrative duties with vivid images of the human faces that depend on your decisions. You see endless lines of workers waiting for their rations, their expressions shifting from patience to anxiety to desperation as your calculations prove inadequate to the challenge of maintaining both current survival and future security. These dreams have a quality of mathematical precision mixed with emotional intensity, as if your unconscious mind is attempting to solve equations that have no perfect solutions. The gradual wearing away of your own teeth serves as a personal reminder of the fundamental challenges that face all Egyptians, regardless of their social status. The way that survival in this environment exacts its toll on every human body over time. Your molars, ground down by years of consuming food, contaminated with stone, dust, and sand, ache with a familiar pain that increases during periods of stress and reminds you that even your privileged position cannot completely protect you from the physical realities of life along the Nile. The political implications of your work add another layer of complexity to decisions that are already difficult on purely practical grounds. Reduced rations that might be acceptable from a nutritional standpoint could become sources of social unrest if they are perceived as unfair or if they fall too far below the expectations that have been established during years of abundance. The delicate balance between adequate nutrition and social stability requires constant adjustment and careful attention to the subtle signs of growing discontent among the populations under your administration. The dawn of another day brings with it the familiar ritual of accounting that has come to define your existence as overseer of the royal granaries. The papyrus scrolls that await your attention each morning have multiplied like the desert sands, each document representing another aspect of the complex web of distribution and calculation that keeps the kingdom fed during these increasingly difficult times. Your fingers, stained with ink from countless hours of record keeping, move with practiced efficiency across the reed paper. But each symbol you inscribe carries with it the weight of human consequences that extend far beyond the mathematical abstractions of administrative life. The reports from your subordinate officials paint a picture of mounting tension throughout your administrative district, subtle signs of strain that speak to the cumulative effect of months of reduced rations and the psychological burden of uncertainty about the future. Workers arrive at the distribution points earlier each day, their eagerness to secure their allotment reflecting an anxiety that was absent during times of abundance. The conversations that your assistants overhear while supervising the daily distributions have taken on an increasingly urgent quality. Discussions of hunger and hardship that were once whispered in private, now spoken openly in the lines that form outside the granary buildings. Your morning inspection of the granary facilities themselves has become a ritual of careful observation and calculation, each visit revealing new evidence of the steady depletion of stores that once seemed inexhaustible. The massive rooms that house the kingdom's grain reserves echo now with a hollowness that speaks of diminished abundance. The sound of your footsteps reflecting off walls that were once hidden behind towering piles of emmer wheat and barley. The remaining grain, though still substantial by any absolute measure, appears almost lost in the vast spaces designed to accommodate the generous harvests of more favorable years. The psychological toll of your responsibilities manifests itself in physical symptoms that mirror the dental wear experienced by all Egyptians, but accelerated by the stress and irregular eating patterns that accompany administrative crisis. Your jaw aches with a frequency that was unknown during periods of routine administration. The muscles that control chewing tightening with tension that extends far beyond the physical effort required to process your daily food. The grinding of your teeth during sleep has become severe enough to wake you in the pre-dawn hours. Your unconscious mind apparently unable to escape the rhythmic motions that define both grain processing and the slow destruction of dental enamel that marks all Egyptian life. The reports that arrive from other administrative districts throughout the kingdom provide both comfort and concern, confirming that your struggles are shared across the realm while also revealing varying degrees of success that different approaches to rationing have achieved. Some administrators have managed to maintain higher distribution levels by implementing more aggressive foraging programs, organizing expeditions to collect wild plants and seeds that can supplement the official grain rations. Others have experimented with alternative food sources, from increased fishing quotas to the cultivation of fast-growing vegetables that can provide nutrition while requiring minimal irrigation water. The social dynamics of distribution have evolved in ways that reflect the increasing pressure on available resources and the human tendency to form hierarchies even within systems designed to ensure equitable treatment. Workers, whose families include members skilled in food processing, have begun to achieve better nutrition from the same rations by developing techniques for removing contamination and maximizing the nutritional value of increasingly challenging raw materials. This informal knowledge sharing has created subtle but important differences in health and morale among families who theoretically receive identical allotments. Your evening meetings with fellow administrators have taken on the quality of tactical conferences, gatherings, where practical men share hard-won knowledge about the management of scarcity and the prevention of social unrest. The discussions range from technical questions about grain storage and pest control to more philosophical considerations about the moral obligations of officials who must choose between current comfort and future survival. The solutions that emerge from these sessions often involve compromises that would have been unthinkable during times of abundance. Trade-offs between competing values that reflect the harsh realities of governance during periods of environmental stress. The documentation of these difficult decisions requires careful attention to both accuracy and political sensitivity, as the records you create will eventually be reviewed by higher authorities who may not fully understand the constraints under which you operate. Your scribes have developed an elaborate system of notation that captures not only the numerical details of distribution and consumption, but also the contextual factors that influence each decision. These records, inscribed on papyrus with the same reed pens and mineral-based inks that have served Egyptian administration for centuries, will provide future officials with the information they need to understand and evaluate your stewardship during this challenging period. The physical environment of your administrative duties has begun to reflect the strain of prolonged crisis management. As the spaces where you work take on the accumulated evidence of countless hours of intensive calculation and consultation, the surfaces of your working tables bear the marks of thousands of papyrus scrolls. The fibers of the reed paper leaving microscopic deposits that build up over time into visible patterns of wear. The floor of your office, despite regular sweeping, shows the inevitable accumulation of sand and dust that accompanies all human activity in Egypt. The particles settling into the gaps between stones and creating a permanent record of the movement and activity that characterizes administrative work. The quality of your own nutrition has become a subject of careful personal monitoring as you attempt to maintain the physical and mental capacity required for effective decision-making while setting an example of shared sacrifice for your subordinates. The meals that you consume in private are carefully planned to provide adequate nutrition while avoiding the appearance of excessive privilege that could undermine morale among the workers whose rations you control. This self-imposed discipline extends to the preparation and consumption of your food, as you deliberately choose cooking methods and serving sizes that mirror, though at a higher quality level, the experiences of those whose survival depends on your administrative competence. The letters that you compose to higher authorities require careful attention to tone and content, as you must communicate the seriousness of the situation while avoiding language that might be interpreted as criticism of royal policies or predictions of failure that could be seen as disloyal. The papyrus that carries these messages will travel throughout the kingdom via the efficient messenger system that connects administrative centers, but the words you choose must be precise enough to convey necessary information while remaining sufficiently optimistic to maintain confidence in your ability to manage the crisis successfully. The training of subordinate officials has become increasingly important as the complexity of distribution decisions exceeds the capacity of any single administrator to manage effectively. Your junior scribes now require education not only in the traditional skills of calculation and record keeping, but also in the more subtle arts of crowd management and conflict resolution that become necessary when resources are insufficient to satisfy all demands completely. These educational sessions, conducted in the cool evening hours when administrative duties permit, cover topics that range from the technical aspects of grain measurement to the psychological factors that influence public acceptance of reduced rations. Your personal relationship with food has undergone fundamental changes as the abstract calculations of your professional duties merge with the intimate reality of daily consumption. Each meal becomes an exercise in conscious evaluation as you assess not only the flavors and textures that define eating pleasure, but also the political and economic implications of every ingredient that reaches your table. The bread that accompanies your evening meal carries with it the weight of decision and consequence. Each bite a reminder of the thousands of similar meals that depend on the accuracy of your calculations and the wisdom of your policies. The seasonal cycles that once provided predictable rhythms for agricultural planning have become sources of anxiety as climate variability increases the uncertainty that surrounds all long-term planning. The approach of the next flood season brings with it both hope for improved harvests and fear that another inadequate inundation could transform the current difficulties into genuine catastrophe. Your preparations for these possibilities require not only practical measures like improved storage techniques and alternative food sources, but also the psychological preparation necessary to maintain effective leadership during periods of genuine crisis. The months of careful calculation and gradual reduction have led inexorably to this moment, when the mathematical abstractions of administration must give way to the harsh reality of choices that will determine who eats and who goes hungry in the final weeks before the next harvest. Your granaries, once monuments to Egyptian abundance, now echo with a hollowness that speaks more eloquently than any papyrus scroll of the kingdom's reduced circumstances. The grain that remains represents perhaps 6 weeks of distribution at current levels, a finite resource that must be allocated with the precision of a master craftsman and the wisdom of a philosopher, for any miscalculation could precipitate the social collapse that would render all previous efforts meaningless. The early morning light, filtering through the high windows of your administrative chamber, illuminates papyrus scrolls covered with calculations that have consumed your days and haunted your nights for countless weeks. Each symbol inscribed in the precise hieratic script represents not merely quantities of grain, but human lives hanging in the balance. Families whose survival depends on decisions that must somehow balance the competing demands of justice, necessity, and the long-term stability of the kingdom. The ink that records these figures has been mixed with water drawn from the same Nile that failed to achieve its usual flood heights, a symbolic reminder that even the tools of administration carry within them the environmental constraints that shape all aspects of Egyptian life. Your morning inspection of the remaining grain stores has become a ritual of careful measurement and somber contemplation as you walk through the vast chambers that once overflowed with a golden abundance of successful harvests, but now contain only carefully rationed piles of emmer, wheat, and barley. The grain itself bears the accumulated evidence of extended storage, its surface coated with a fine layer of dust that speaks of the patient settling of particles from the air over many months. The familiar, gritty texture that characterizes all Egyptian food has intensified during the storage period, as the constant movement of air through the granary buildings has deposited additional sand and debris onto the precious kernels. The mathematical precision required for effective rationing has reached levels of complexity that would have been inconceivable during normal times. As you calculate not only daily distribution rates, but also the optimal allocation strategies that might extend the life of your remaining stores while maintaining minimal nutritional adequacy for the largest possible number of people. Your evening sessions with the senior scribes now resemble councils of war more than administrative meetings, as practical men search for solutions to problems that seem to have no acceptable answers. The papyrus sheets that record these deliberations are covered with calculations that explore every possible combination of distribution rates and survival probabilities, mathematical exercises that attempt to quantify the unquantifiable relationships between human need and resource availability. The reed pens that inscribe these figures move with the mechanical precision of desperation, creating documents that serve as both historical records and practical guides for decisions that will determine the fate of thousands of people. The personal toll of these responsibilities has manifested itself in physical symptoms that mirror the effects of malnutrition experienced by those whose rations you control. Though your own access to food remains technically adequate, the constant stress of decision-making has affected your ability to properly digest even the higher quality meals that your position provides, creating a form of nutritional inefficiency that leaves you feeling perpetually hungry despite consuming sufficient calories. Your teeth ached with a persistence that extends beyond the normal wear patterns associated with Egyptian diet, the grinding tension of sleepless nights and constant worry, manifesting itself in jaw pain that increases with each passing day. The social fabric of your administrative district has begun to show signs of strain that extend beyond the immediate effects of reduced nutrition, as traditional patterns of cooperation and mutual support give way to the more competitive dynamics that emerge when resources become insufficient to meet basic needs. Families that once shared food preparation tasks and equipment now guard their rations jealously, while the informal networks of assistance that helped weaker members of the community survive previous hardships have largely dissolved under the pressure of universal need. The religious dimensions of food distribution have assumed new importance as temple officials become essential partners in maintaining social cohesion during periods of severe hardship. The priests who oversee local spiritual observances possess both moral authority and practical knowledge about fasting and food conservation that complement your administrative expertise. Their involvement in the rationing process provides not only additional organizational capacity, but also the spiritual framework that helps communities understand temporary sacrifice as part of a larger divine plan rather than evidence of administrative failure or cosmic disorder. The documentation of distribution decisions has become increasingly detailed as you attempt to create records that will justify your choices to future reviewers who may not fully understand the constraints under which you operated. Each papyrus scroll now contains not only the numerical data of quantities distributed, but also extensive notes about the circumstances that influenced each decision, the alternative options that were considered and rejected, and the reasoning that led to specific allocation choices. These documents, inscribed with the careful precision that characterizes Egyptian administrative practice, will provide future officials with the information they need to understand and evaluate your stewardship during this unprecedented period of scarcity. The collaboration with officials from neighboring districts has intensified as regional administrators attempt to coordinate their responses to challenges that transcend individual administrative boundaries. The messenger system that once carried routine communications about surplus transfers and trade arrangements now facilitates urgent consultations about survival strategies and resource sharing agreements. The papyrus that carries these messages travels along roads dusty with the passage of refugees and traders seeking food in districts that might have fared better during the current crisis. The innovation in food preparation techniques has accelerated under the pressure of necessity, as families develop increasingly sophisticated methods for extracting maximum nutrition from rations that would have been considered inadequate during times of abundance. These techniques, ranging from extended soaking and fermentation processes to complex grinding and sifting procedures, represent a form of practical knowledge that complements the theoretical understanding that guides official policy. The documentation of these innovations has become an important part of your administrative duties, as successful techniques can be shared with other families who may lack the experience or resources to develop effective strategies. Independently, the personal relationships that define your social world have been transformed. by the constant awareness of scarcity and the moral burden of decisions that affect the survival of people you know as individuals rather than statistical abstractions. The conversations that take place during eating meals with your family and friends now revolve around same themes of rationing and survival that dominate your professional duties, creating a seamless integration of personal and administrative concerns that reflects the totalizing nature of crisis management during periods of genuine hardship. The quality of sleep that once provided respite from the demands of administrative responsibility has deteriorated as the mental processes required for effective decision-making continue even during periods of attempted rest. Your dreams now regularly feature the same calculations and projections that fill your waking hours, creating a continuous loop of mathematical anxiety that prevents the psychological recovery necessary for sustained, effective leadership. The physical manifestations of this sleep disruption include increased dental grinding and jaw tension that accelerates the normal, were patterns associated with Egyptian diet and lifestyle that the approach of the next flood season brings with it, a complex mixture of hope and apprehension, as the possibility of improved harvests must be balanced against the reality that current stores will be exhausted before any new grain becomes available. Your preparations for this transition period require not only practical measures like seed conservation and planting optimization, but also the social and psychological groundwork necessary to maintain community cohesion during the most vulnerable weeks of the agricultural cycle. The letters that you compose to higher authorities have evolved from routine administrative reports to carefully crafted documents that must communicate the severity of the situation while avoiding language that might be interpreted as defeatist or disloyal. The papyrus that carries these messages will be read by officials whose understanding of local conditions may be limited by distance and competing priorities, making the precision of your language a matter of survival not only for your district, but potentially for the kingdom as a whole. The legacy of your administrative decisions during this period of crisis will extend far beyond the immediate questions of survival and resource allocation, creating precedents and procedures that will influence Egyptian administrative practice for generations to come. The innovations in rationing methodology and crisis management that emerge from your current struggles will become part of the institutional knowledge that prepares future officials for similar challenges, while the detailed records you maintain will provide historical examples of effective leadership during periods of extreme hardship. The final weeks of your grain reserves stretch before you like a mathematical countdown to catastrophe or salvation, each day's distribution bringing you closer to the moment when calculation must give way to faith and careful planning must yield to the unpredictable variables of weather and fortune. The numbers that define your world have been reduced to their essential elements, the simple arithmetic of survival that strips away all administrative complexity to reveal the fundamental truth that life depends on the daily grinding of grain between stone and the human capacity to endure hardship with dignity and mutual support. Let us now turn our attention from the lived experience of ancient Egyptian dining to the patient testimony of archaeological evidence, those silent witnesses buried in sand and preserved by the dry desert air that tell their own stories of grit and survival in the slow destruction that accompanied every meal along the banks of the Nile, in the ruins of settlements that once bustled with the daily activity of food preparation and consumption. Modern excavators uncovered the physical remnants of a dietary culture that left its mark not only on human teeth and bones, but on every tool and vessel that participated in the eternal struggle to transform raw grain into nourishment. The skeletal remains that emerge from carefully excavated burial sites speak with startling clarity about the relationship between food and dental health in ancient Egypt. Their silent testimony, more eloquent than any written record in documenting the price that survival exacted from every human body. The skulls that archaeologists lift from their sandy resting places, cleaned and cataloged with scientific precision, reveal patterns of tooth where they tell detailed stories about diet, social status, and the grinding reality of daily sustenance in a world where every meal came seasoned with stone, dust, and sand, the molars of ordinary workers, examined under the revealing light of modern laboratory conditions, show were patterns that would horrify contemporary dental practitioners, but which were simply the normal consequence of a lifetime of consuming food prepared with stone grinding tools. The enamel that once protected these teeth has been worn away with mathematical precision, the grinding surfaces reduced to irregular planes of exposed dentin that speak of decades of patient chewing through mixtures of grain and granite particles. The pain that these individuals must have endured during their final years becomes apparent through the examination of tooth roots that show signs of infection and abscess, the inevitable result of dental destruction that proceeded far beyond the protective capacity of natural enamel. The gradual progression of dental work can be traced through skeletal populations that represent different age groups, creating a timeline of destruction that began with the tug and me, with the first solid foods of childhood, and continued relentlessly until death provided the only respite from the constant grinding of stone against tooth. Young adults show the initial stages of enamel loss, their molars beginning to develop the characteristic flat surfaces that marked all Egyptian teeth, while middle-aged individuals display the advanced wear patterns that reduce their grinding surfaces to rough approximations of their original form. The most severely affected specimens, representing individuals who survived into their later years despite the challenges of their diet, show tooth were so extensive that the original crown structure has been completely eliminated, leaving only root fragments embedded in jawbones that bared their own evidence of the constant stress imposed by the need to process increasingly difficult food. These elderly survivors had learned to adapt their eating habits to accommodate teeth that could no longer perform their intended function, developing techniques for softening food and avoiding the hardest materials that would have been impossible to chew with their reduced dental capacity. The social stratification of ancient Egyptian society becomes apparent through comparative analysis of skeletal remains from different burial contexts, as the teeth of elite individuals show markedly different wear patterns from those of common workers and agricultural laborers. The grinding surfaces of aristocratic molars, while still showing the inevitable effects of stone-contaminated food, retain more of their original enamel and demonstrate less severe erosion than their counterparts from worker cemeteries. This difference reflects not only access to higher quality food preparation techniques, but also the fundamental distinction between those who performed physical labor and those whose social position protected them from the most demanding aspects of survival. The pottery vessels that filled the daily lives of ancient Egyptians carry their own testimony to the abrasive nature of food preparation in their world, their surfaces bearing the accumulated evidence of countless meals and the cleaning processes that followed each use. The interior surfaces of grain storage jars show characteristic wear patterns where stone particles suspended in stored wheat and barley gradually abraded the fired clay, creating smooth depressions that speak of years of contact with gritty contents. The grinding bowls and serving vessels that participated directly in food preparation show even more dramatic evidence of their abrasive environment, their surfaces worn smooth by the constant contact with sand-laden food and the cleaning procedures that used desert sand as a scouring agent. The cornstones that served as the foundation of Egyptian food preparation represent perhaps the most direct evidence of the relationship between nourishment and destruction that characterized ancient dining. These heavy granite implements, recovered from sites throughout the Nile Valley, bear the unmistakable marks of their function in the form of wear patterns that document thousands of hours of grinding grain into flour. The upper stones, shaped by human hands to fit comfortably in the grasp, show the characteristic depressions where fingers grip the implements during the repetitive motions of grain processing, while the lower stones display the broad, shallow channels created by years of rolling contact with their grinding partners. The microscopic analysis of residue found in these grinding implements reveals the complex mixture of organic and mineral materials that characterized ancient Egyptian flour, with plant matter from emmer, wheat, and barley intimately mixed with particles of granite, limestone, and desert sand. The proportions of these materials vary depending on the quality of the grinding stones and the care taken during the preparation process, but even the finest examples show significant contamination that would render the salting flour unacceptable by modern standards. The wear patterns on the stones themselves demonstrate how each use contributed particles of ground rock to the flour, creating a continuous cycle of contamination that could never be completely eliminated. The analysis of coprolites, those preserved human waste deposits that provide intimate details about ancient diet and digestion, offers perhaps the most direct evidence of how stone particles passed through ancient Egyptian digestive systems. These fossil specimens, covered from desert sites where exceptional preservation conditions have maintained organic materials for millennia, contain not only the expected plant fibers from grain consumption, but also significant quantities of sand and stone particles that pass through the human body without being absorbed or broken down. The mineral content of these specimens provides detailed information about the geological sources of contamination in ancient Egyptian food, with particles identifiable as originating from specific types of grinding stones and particular regions of the Nile Valley. The size distribution of these particles suggests that while the largest fragments were removed during food preparation, substantial quantities of fine sand and stone dust remained, integrated with the flour and other food materials throughout the cooking and consumption process. The preservation of bread fragments in tomb contexts has provided archaeologists with direct samples of ancient Egyptian baked goods, specimens that retain not only their original shape and texture, but also the characteristic gritty composition that defined all grain-based foods in this civilization. These desiccated loaves, protected from decay by the dry desert environment, can be sectioned and analyzed to reveal the internal structure of ancient bread and the distribution of mineral particles throughout the baked matrix. The microscopic examination of these bread samples reveals a complex internal architecture, where wheat and barley proteins form a matrix that encases countless particles of sand and ground stone, creating a composite material that served nutritional and destructive functions simultaneously. The size and distribution of these mineral inclusions demonstrate that ancient bakers made no systematic attempt to remove contamination from their flour, accepting the presence of abrasive particles as an inevitable consequence of their food preparation methods. The brewing equipment, recovered from archaeological contexts, tells its own story of gritty consumption, as the pottery vessels used for beer production show evidence of the same mineral contamination that affected all aspects of ancient Egyptian cuisine. The fermentation jars that transformed grain into the thick, nutritious beverage that sustained daily life bear interior deposits that include not only the expected organic residues from brewing processes, but also substantial quantities of sand and stone particles that settled out of the grain mash during fermentation. The filtration systems that ancient brewers used to clarify their products, when they can be identified in archaeological contexts, demonstrate the limited effectiveness of ancient attempts to remove solid particles from liquid foods. The reed screens and cloth filters that served this function retained the largest debris, but allowed fine sand and stone dust to pass through into the finished beverage, ensuring that even this liquid nourishment carried its burden of dental destruction. The storage and transport containers that moved food throughout the ancient Egyptian economic system bear their own evidence of the pervasive contamination that characterized all aspects of food handling in this civilization. The interior surfaces of grain storage vessels show characteristic patterns of abrasion where sand-laden contents gradually wore away the pottery walls during extended storage periods, while the amphoras used for liquid transport display similar wear patterns around their openings where gritty contents passed through during filling and emptying operations. The analysis of residues found in these containers reveals the complex chemistry of ancient food preservation, with natural fermentation processes competing against the abrasive effects of mineral contamination to determine the ultimate quality and safety of stored foods. The successful preservation of grain and other organic materials required careful balance between preventing spoilage and accepting the inevitable degradation of quality that resulted from extended contact with contaminated storage environments. The funerary goods that accompanied wealthy Egyptians into their eternal afterlife provide insight into the idealized version of dining that elite members of society hoped to continue beyond death. But even these carefully prepared foods show evidence of the fundamental grittiness that characterized all ancient Egyptian cuisine. The bread, beer, and other provisions placed in tomb chambers were prepared using the same stone grinding tools and contaminated ingredients that defined daily life, ensuring that even the food of the gods carried its burden of sand and stone particles. The comparison between idealized tomb foods and the everyday dietary remains recovered from settlement contexts reveals the extent to which gritty contamination was accepted as a normal aspect of nourishment throughout all levels of ancient Egyptian society. While elite individuals had access to finer preparation techniques and higher quality raw materials, they could not completely escape the fundamental environmental conditions that introduced mineral particles into all food preparation processes. The scientific analysis of ancient Egyptian mummy tissues has revealed the systemic effects of lifelong consumption of contaminated food, with microscopic examination of preserved organs showing accumulations of sand and stone particles that had been absorbed into body tissues over decades of grinding consumption. The liver and kidney tissues of well-preserved mummies contain detectable quantities of silica and other mineral particles that originated in the grinding tools and contaminated grain that formed the foundation of ancient Egyptian diet. The dental work visible in some elite mummies demonstrates that ancient Egyptians were not ignorant of the destructive effects of their diet, but lacked the technical means to effectively address the fundamental causes of tooth wear. The gold wire that binds loose teeth in some specimens and the evidence of primitive dental procedures suggest that wealthy individuals were attempting to preserve their dental function as long as possible. But these measures addressed symptoms rather than the underlying dietary causes of dental destruction. The modern laboratory analysis of ancient Egyptian food remains has revealed the complex chemical processes that governed nutrition and contamination in this desert civilization, providing scientific confirmation of the grinding reality that archaeological evidence only suggests. Through sophisticated techniques that can identify molecular traces of ancient meals and measure the precise composition of mineral contaminants, researchers have constructed a detailed picture of the chemical landscape that shaped every aspect of ancient Egyptian dining, from the initial grinding of grain to the final absorption of nutrients by human digestive systems. The spectroscopic analysis of residues extracted from ancient cooking vessels reveals the chemical signatures of meals prepared thousands of years ago, with organic compounds from emmer, wheat, and barley still detectable alongside the mineral components that were introduced during food preparation. These molecular fossils tell stories of fermentation and decomposition, of the complex chemical reactions that transformed raw grain into edible bread and drinkable beer. while simultaneously incorporating stone particles that would challenge human dental enamel with every bite. The electron microscopy of flour samples recovered from sealed storage containers has provided unprecedented detail about the physical structure of ancient Egyptian grain products, revealing how stone particles became integrated with plant matter at the cellular level during the grinding process. The images produced by these powerful instruments show wheat and barley fragments intimately mixed with angular pieces of granite and limestone, creating composite materials where nutritional and destructive elements exist in permanent union. The chemical analysis of these composite materials demonstrates that the mineral contamination of ancient Egyptian food was not merely superficial, but penetrated deeply into the structure of grain products through mechanical processes that broke down cell walls and allowed stone particles to become embedded within the organic matrix of flour. The silicon dioxide content of these samples, derived primarily from granite grinding stones, reaches levels that would be considered dangerous by modern food safety standards. Yet this contamination was simply an accepted aspect of daily nutrition throughout Egyptian history. The isotopic analysis of carbon and nitrogen preserved in ancient bread samples has provided insights into the agricultural practices that supplied grain for urban populations, revealing how environmental conditions affected crop quality and, consequently, the nutritional value of food that already carried significant mineral contamination. The chemical signatures preserved in these specimens indicate that ancient Egyptian wheat and barley were often stressed by drought conditions that reduced protein content while concentrating mineral particles from irrigation, water in the grain tissues. The preservation of brewing residues in sealed tomb jars has allowed researchers to reconstruct the chemical processes that transformed grain into the thick, nutritious beer that formed a central part of ancient Egyptian diet, revealing how fermentation interacted with mineral contamination to create beverages that were simultaneously nourishing and abrasive. The analysis of these ancient beer samples shows complex chemical environments where beneficial fermentation products coexisted with harmful stone particles that had been introduced during the grain grinding process. The microscopic examination of yeast cells preserved in these brewing residues demonstrates that ancient Egyptian fermentation was often incomplete due to the hostile chemical environment created by high concentrations of mineral particles, resulting in beer with reduced alcohol content and increased levels of unfermented sugars that provided nutrition but also contributed to dental decay. The chemical composition of these preserved beverages reflects the fundamental compromise that characterized all ancient Egyptian food, where nutritional benefits could never be separated from destructive contaminants. The analysis of lipid residues extracted from ancient cooking vessels has revealed the chemical signatures of the oils and fats that were used to enhance the palatability of grain-based foods, providing evidence of sophisticated flavor chemistry that attempted to mask the harsh textures and tastes associated with stone-contaminated ingredients. The molecular profiles of these preserved cooking fats show evidence of thermal degradation and oxidation that resulted from cooking processes designed to soften abrasive food materials and make them more digestible. The trace element analysis of ancient Egyptian mummy tissues has confirmed that the consumption of mineral-contaminated food had systemic effects that extended far beyond dental wear, with accumulations of silicon, aluminum, and iron detected in preserved organs that had absorbed these elements over decades of dietary exposure. The chemical profiles of these tissue samples provide direct evidence of how the grinding tools and contaminated ingredients that characterized ancient Egyptian food preparation left permanent traces in the bodies of those who consumed their products. The comparison of elemental concentrations in mummy tissues from different social classes reveals that while elite individuals had access to somewhat less contaminated food, they could not completely escape the chemical consequences of living in an environment where all food preparation involved stone, grinding tools, and sand-laden ingredients. The mineral signatures preserved in aristocratic mummies differ in degree rather than kind from those found in common workers, demonstrating that stone dust contamination affected all levels of ancient Egyptian society. The chemical analysis of dental calculus removed from ancient Egyptian teeth has provided detailed information about the specific foods consumed by individuals thousands of years ago, with microscopic plant fragments and mineral particles preserved in the calcified deposits that formed around teeth throughout their owners' lifetimes. These biological archives contain direct evidence of the daily grinding that characterized ancient Egyptian dining, with stone particles embedded alongside food debris in deposits that accumulated meal by meal over years of abrasive consumption. The identification of specific plant proteins preserved in dental calculus has allowed researchers to reconstruct individual dietary patterns and seasonal variations in food availability, revealing how ancient Egyptians adapted their eating habits to accommodate the changing quality of available ingredients throughout the agricultural year. The chemical signatures of these preserved proteins indicate periods of dietary stress when lower quality foods with higher contamination levels became necessary for survival. The molecular analysis of preserved stomach contents from exceptionally well-preserved mummies has provided the most direct evidence possible of ancient Egyptian meals, with the chemical composition of final meals still detectable after thousands of years of preservation. These specimens contain not only the expected organic components from grain-based foods, but also significant quantities of mineral particles that have been consumed along with nutritional elements, providing confirmation of the integrated nature of nourishment and contamination in ancient Egyptian diet. The chemical characterization of ancient Egyptian salt deposits has revealed how the mineral enhancement of food contributed additional abrasive elements to an already challenging dietary environment, with naturally occurring sodium chloride containing significant quantities of sand and other impurities that could not be removed using available purification techniques. The analysis of these salt samples shows complex chemical compositions that included not only sodium and chloride ions, but also substantial concentrations of silica and other mineral contaminants. The study of ancient Egyptian food preservation chemistry has demonstrated how techniques designed to extend the storage life of grain and other perishables often concentrated mineral contaminants while achieving their intended preservation effects. The chemical analysis of preserved fish and meat samples shows how salt curing and dehydration processes created foods with enhanced keeping qualities but also increased abrasive properties that challenged human dental structures even more severely than fresh foods. The reconstruction of ancient Egyptian cooking chemistry through experimental archaeology has confirmed that the thermal processing methods available to ancient cooks could soften food textures, but could not eliminate the fundamental abrasiveness of stone-contaminated ingredients. The chemical changes that occur when grain flour is mixed with water and heated produce more digestible starches and proteins, but do not affect the mineral particles that remain suspended throughout the food matrix. The analysis of lipid profiles in ancient Egyptian cooking residues has revealed how fats and oils were used not only for flavor enhancement, but also as lubricants intended to ease the consumption of abrasive foods, with chemical evidence suggesting that cooks understood the protective effects of fat coatings on dental structures, even if they lacked modern scientific explanations for these phenomena. The molecular signatures of these preserved cooking fats show evidence of deliberate selection for oils with properties that would help protect teeth and gums from the harsh effects of stone-contaminated food. The chemical analysis of ancient Egyptian Textile fibers used for food processing has provided evidence of how cloth screening and filtering techniques affected the contamination levels of finished food products, with microscopic examination revealing that even fine linen screens could not remove the smallest stone particles from ground grain. The mineral residues found embedded in these ancient textiles demonstrate that food processing equipment became contaminated through use and contributed additional particles to subsequent batches of food. The study of ancient Egyptian pottery. Chemistry has revealed how the firing temperatures and clay compositions used for food vessels affected their durability under the abrasive conditions created by stone-contaminated food, with chemical analysis showing that vessel surfaces gradually abraded during use and contributed pottery particles to the foods they contained. The silicon and aluminum signatures found in food residues include contributions from ceramic vessels as well as grinding stones, creating multiple sources of mineral contamination that affected every aspect of food preparation and consumption. The molecular analysis of ancient Egyptian adhesives and sealants used for food storage has demonstrated how organic compounds were employed to protect stored grain from insect and rodent damage. But these same preservation techniques often trap sand and dust particles against grain surfaces where they became integrated with food materials during subsequent processing. The chemical profiles of these preserved organic sealants show how environmental contamination became incorporated into food storage systems despite efforts to maintain quality. The reconstruction of ancient Egyptian digestive chemistry through modern metabolic studies has provided insights into how human bodies processed the complex mixtures of nutrients and mineral contaminants that characterize this ancient diet, revealing that while digestive systems could extract nutritional value from heavily contaminated food, they could not prevent the accumulation of indigestible particles in body tissues. The chemical pathways that govern ancient Egyptian nutrition involved constant exposure to abrasive materials that gradually accumulated in organs and tissues throughout the lifespan of individuals who consumed these challenging foods. The study of ancient Egyptian dental pathology has revealed patterns of destruction so consistent and predictable that they form a kind of slow poetry written in enamel and dentin, a gradual narrative of survival that played out over decades in the mouths of every individual who lived and died along the banks of the Nile. The archaeological record preserves thousands of these dental stories, each skull a complete chronicle of accommodation and adaptation to a dietary environment that demanded constant compromise between nourishment and preservation of oral health. The progression of tooth wear in ancient Egyptian populations follows patterns that modern dental science can read like the rings of ancient trees, with each year of life leaving its mark in the form of gradually flattened crowns and exposed root surfaces that tell stories of patient endurance and the slow grinding away of protective enamel. The youngest adult specimens show teeth that still retain much of their original crown height and surface detail, their grinding surfaces marked by the characteristic striations that result from chewing food contaminated with stone particles but not yet worn down to the severe levels that marked older individuals. The middle-aged specimens reveal teeth that have lost perhaps half of their original crown height, their grinding surfaces transformed into broad, flat planes that speak of decades of contact with abrasive food materials. The enamel that once provided smooth, efficient chewing surfaces has been worn away to reveal the softer dentin beneath, creating teeth that were simultaneously less effective at processing food and more vulnerable to further tame it from continued abrasive contact. These individuals had learned to modify their eating habits to accommodate dental structures that could no longer perform their original functions with full efficiency. The elderly specimens, representing individuals who survived into their later years despite the challenges of their dietary environment, show tooth were so extensive that the original crown structure has been almost completely eliminated, leaving only root fragments and remnants of crown bases that speak of remarkable adaptation to severe dental limitations. These individuals had somehow learned to maintain adequate nutrition despite having grinding surfaces that bore little resemblance to functional teeth, developing techniques for food preparation and consumption that allowed survival, even with severely compromised oral health. The comparison of wear patterns between different tooth types reveals how ancient Egyptians adapted their chewing behaviors to distribute the destructive effects of abrasive food as widely as possible throughout their dental structures. The molars, designed by evolution for grinding and crushing, show the most severe wear patterns. Their broad surfaces bearing the primary burden of processing stone-contaminated grain products. The premolars display intermediate levels of wear, suggesting that they served as secondary grinding surfaces when molars became too damaged to function effectively. Even the canine teeth, normally reserved for tearing rather than grinding, show evidence of adaptation to the abrasive dietary environment of ancient Egypt, with wear patterns that indicate they were pressed into service for food processing tasks that would normally have been performed by molars and premolars. The incisors, typically used for cutting and biting, display flattened edges and surface wear that speaks of their recruitment into the complex process of breaking down foods that challenged every available dental surface. The microscopic analysis of ancient Egyptian tooth wear reveals the specific mechanisms by which stone particles destroyed dental enamel, with scanning electron microscopy showing characteristic patterns of scratching and pitting that result from the rolling and sliding action of hard mineral particles against tooth surfaces during chewing. These microscopic damage patterns provide detailed evidence of how each meal contributed its own small increment to the gradual destruction of dental structures, creating cumulative damage that eventually rendered teeth incapable of performing their intended functions. The direction and depth of where striations preserved on ancient Egyptian teeth provide information about the specific chewing motions and food processing techniques that characterized ancient dining, revealing that individuals developed distinctive patterns of jaw movement that reflected their attempts to minimize dental damage while maintaining adequate food processing capability. The analysis of these wear patterns suggests that ancient Egyptians understood intuitively the relationship between chewing, technique, and tooth preservation, developing strategies that distributed abrasive contact across multiple surfaces rather than concentrating destructive forces on individual teeth. The evidence of dental adaptation extends beyond simple wear patterns to include changes in jaw muscle attachment sites and temporomandibular joint structures that reflect the increased mechanical demands imposed by processing abrasive foods. Throughout a lifetime of challenging nutrition, the bone surfaces where powerful chewing muscles attached to ancient Egyptian skulls show enlarged and roughened areas that speak of muscular development beyond what would be expected for individuals consuming modern diets, indicating that the act of eating required significantly more physical effort than contemporary food consumption. The chemical analysis of ancient Egyptian dental tissues has revealed how prolonged exposure to abrasive foods affected not only the visible surfaces of teeth, but also the internal structures that provided strength and stability to these essential tools of survival. The dentin that lies beneath protective enamel shows evidence of chemical changes that result from chronic exposure to the acidic conditions created when food particles remain trapped against tooth surfaces for extended periods, creating environments that accelerated the natural processes of dental decay and destruction. The study of ancient Egyptian dental infections has provided evidence of how tooth wear progressed beyond simple enamel loss to create pathways for bacterial invasion that led to abscesses and other serious oral health problems. The bone changes visible in ancient skulls around severely worn teeth tell stories of chronic pain and systemic infection that resulted when dental Destruction proceeded to the point where protective barriers were completely eliminated and oral bacteria gained access to the pulp chambers and root canals of living teeth. The comparison of dental health between different age groups in ancient Egyptian populations reveals that tooth wear was not simply a consequence of advanced age, but began in childhood and progressed relentlessly throughout life, with even young adults showing levels of dental damage that would be considered severe by modern standards. The deciduous teeth of ancient Egyptian children show patterns that confirmed the early introduction of abrasive foods into the diet, creating damage that established patterns of dental destruction that would continue throughout the individual's lifetime. The social stratification of dental wear patterns provides evidence that access to higher quality food preparation techniques could moderate but not eliminate the destructive effects of ancient Egyptian diet, with elite individuals showing somewhat less severe tooth wear than common workers, but still displaying damage patterns that would be considered pathological by contemporary dental standards. The comparison between aristocratic and working-class dental remains suggests that even the best available food preparation methods could not completely protect teeth from the abrasive environment created by stone grinding tools and sand-contaminated ingredients. Seasonal variations in dental wear rates, detectable through microscopic analysis of tooth growth increments, reveal how changes in food availability and quality throughout the agricultural year affected the crawling progression of dental destruction. The periods of increased would correspond to times when food shortages forced ancient Egyptians to consume lower quality grain products with higher concentrations of stone particles, while periods of reduced wear reflect access to fresher, less contaminated foods during harvest seasons. The evidence of dental repair attempts in ancient Egyptian skulls demonstrates that individuals and their communities understood the importance of maintaining oral health and developed primitive but sometimes effective techniques for preserving dental function as long as possible. The gold wire and other materials found binding loose teeth in some elite perios represent sophisticated attempts to maintain chewing capability despite severe tooth wear, while the evidence of tooth extraction in some specimens suggests that ancient dentists understood when preservation efforts were futile and removal was necessary to prevent further complications. The study of ancient Egyptian dietary adaptations through dental analysis has revealed how individuals modified their eating habits as tooth wear progressed, developing techniques for food softening and preparation that allowed continued nutrition despite severely compromised chewing capability. The wear patterns on grinding stones from households with elderly members show evidence of more intensive food processing that would have been necessary to create meals soft enough for consumption by individuals with severely damaged teeth. The relationship between dental wear and overall health in ancient Egyptian populations demonstrates that severe tooth loss was not necessarily incompatible with long-term survival, as evidenced by skeletal remains showing extensive dental destruction, alongside other indicators of advanced age and generally good health. These individuals had somehow learned to maintain adequate nutrition despite oral health challenges that would be considered devastating by modern standards, suggesting remarkable adaptability and community support for those whose teeth could no longer function effectively. The genetic analysis of ancient Egyptian dental tissues has provided insights into the hereditary factors that influenced individual susceptibility to tooth wear, revealing that while environmental factors dominated the dental health landscape of ancient Egypt, genetic variations in enamel thickness and composition created some differences in individual resistance to abrasive damage. The molecular signatures preserved in ancient dental tissues show evidence of adaptive responses to chronic abrasive exposure that developed over generations of challenging dietary conditions to reconstruction of ancient Egyptian oral health practices through archaeological evidence suggests that communities developed cultural knowledge about dental care and maintenance that helped individuals cope with the inevitable progression of tooth wear throughout their lifetimes. The plant materials found in association with some burials include species known to have antimicrobial properties that could have been used for oral hygiene, while the wear patterns on small wooden implements suggest their use as primitive toothbrushes or dental cleaning tools. The comparison of ancient Egyptian dental pathology with contemporary populations consuming similar diets has confirmed that the patterns of tooth were observed in archaeological specimens accurately reflect the consequences of lifelong consumption of foods contaminated with abrasive mineral particles. Modern populations in regions where traditional stone grinding methods are still used show similar progression of dental destruction, validating the archaeological interpretation of ancient Egyptian dental remains and confirming that the grinding reality of stone-contaminated food production creates predictable patterns of oral health deterioration across different cultures and time periods. Let us now turn our attention to a different world within the same kingdom, the realm of Egyptian nobility, where wealth and power created the illusion of escape from the grinding realities that dominated common life. Yet, where the fundamental environmental conditions of desert civilization ensured that even the most privileged tables could not entirely avoid the gritty truth of survival along the Nile. In the grand homes of Memphis and Thebes, where limestone walls rose thick and cool above courtyards paved with polished granite, the elite of Egyptian society gathered for meals that represented the pinnacle of ancient culinary achievement. Yet even these refined occasions carried within them the persistent reminder that all food, regardless of preparation or presentation, bore the signature of sand and stone. Imagine yourself as a guest at the villa of Amenemheb, a high court official whose wealth derived from his position as overseer of royal building projects, a man whose tables groaned under the weight of delicacies that common workers could scarcely imagine, yet whose teeth bore the same telltale patterns of wear that marked every Egyptian mouth. The invitation to dine at such a household represented not merely social privilege, but entry into a world where the harsh realities of survival had been softened by wealth and refined by generations of culinary innovation, though they could never be entirely eliminated. The approach to Amenemheb's villa takes you through gardens that speak of water's triumph over desert, with date palms and fig trees creating pools of shade around carefully tended beds of onions and leeks and other vegetables that require the constant attention of skilled gardeners. The irrigation channels that nourish these growing things carry the same Nile water that sustains all Egyptian agriculture, rich with silt and minerals that will eventually find their way onto the finest plates in the kingdom. The very air in these gardens carries particles of dust and sand that settle constantly on every surface, including the leaves and fruits that will grace the evenings. Feasts, the servants who tend these gardens move with the practiced efficiency of those whose livelihoods depend on maintaining perfection, despite the challenging environmental conditions that affect all outdoor work in Egypt. Their tools, from copper hoes to woven baskets, bear the accumulated evidence of constant contact with sandy soil and gritty irrigation water, while their hands show the characteristic roughness that comes from handling plants that have absorbed mineral particles through their roots and surfaces throughout their growing cycle. The villa itself rises from its garden setting, like a monument to human ingenuity and the power of wealth to create comfort in harsh environments. Its thick limestone walls providing genuine relief from the heat and wind that carry sand through every opening that cannot be sealed against the desert's constant intrusion. The floors, paved with carefully fitted stones and covered with woven reed mats, represent luxury beyond the imagination of common workers. Yet, even these refined surfaces show the inevitable accumulation of dust and grit that marks all human habitation. In this sandy kingdom, the preparation areas where tonight's feast takes shape occupy chambers specifically designed for food processing on a scale that dwarfs the simple cooking arrangements of ordinary households, with multiple grinding stations staffed by skilled servants who have learned to produce flour of exceptional fineness through techniques that go far beyond the basic crushing methods available to common families. Yet, even these refined processes cannot completely eliminate the fundamental challenge of stone ground grain, as the granite querns used in elite kitchens, though better maintained and more carefully selected than their humble counterparts, still contribute their inevitable burden of mineral particles to every product they create. The flour that emerges from these elite grinding operations represents the finest achievable quality in ancient Egyptian cuisine, having been sifted through progressively finer screens of linen cloth until only the smallest particles of stone dust remain integrated with the ground grain. The servants who perform this sifting work with a precision that borders on artistry, their movements refined by years of practice in the service of households where culinary excellence represents both personal pride and social necessity. Yet their finished product, fine as it may be, still carries the geological signature that marks all flour produced by stone grinding methods. The bread that will anchor tonight's feast begins its transformation in ovens constructed of specially selected clay and heated with charcoal rather than the dung and straw that fuel ordinary cooking fires, creating more precise temperature control and cleaner combustion that reduces but cannot eliminate the contamination that affects all Egyptian baking. The bakers who tend these ovens possess skills passed down through generations of service to wealthy households, understanding the subtle relationships between heat and timing that create bread of exceptional quality. Despite the inherent challenges of working with contaminated ingredients, the loaves that emerge from these elite ovens represent the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian baking technology. Their surfaces golden and smooth, their texture fine enough to please the most discerning palates, yet their cores still containing the inevitable mineral particles that no amount of skill or care can completely remove from stone ground flour. The servants who removed these loaves from the ovens handled them with the reverence due to objects that represent both sustenance and artistic achievement, though they understand that even this perfected bread will challenge the teeth of those who consume it. The brewing operations that supply beer for elite consumption employ techniques that go far beyond the simple fermentation methods available to ordinary households, with multiple stages of filtering and clarification designed to remove as much solid contamination as possible while preserving the nutritional, canned alcoholic content that makes beer essential to Egyptian life. The pottery vessels used for elite brewing are selected for their smooth interiors and fine construction, yet they cannot prevent the integration of stone particles that occurs during the grain processing stages that precede fermentation. The beer that results from these refined processes achieves a clarity and smoothness that approaches modern standards, consumed by common workers. Yet, chemical analysis will reveal the persistent presence of mineral particles that have become so finely distributed throughout the liquid that they create texture rather than obvious contamination. The servants who oversee this brewing understand their craft as both practical necessity and aesthetic achievement, creating beverages that satisfy not only thirst and hunger, but also the social expectations of refined consumption. The meat that will provide the centerpiece of tonight's feast represents luxury that extends far beyond simple nutrition, with cuts of beef and lamb that have been carefully selected and prepared using techniques that maximize both flavor and tenderness while minimizing the additional contamination that often accompanies food processing in sandy environments. The butchers who prepared these meats work in covered areas that provide some protection from wind-borne sand. Yet, they cannot eliminate the fine particles that settle on all surfaces and become integrated with food through the inevitable processes of handling and preparation. The preservation techniques used for elite meat consumption employ salt of higher purity than what reaches common tables, with mineral deposits that have been cleaned and refined to remove the most obvious impurities. Though even these improved materials retain substantial quantities of sand and other contaminants that become integrated with the preserved meat through the curing process. The servants who oversee meat preservation understand their work as requiring both technical skill and artistic judgment, creating products that will grace important social occasions while accepting the environmental limitations that affect all food preparation in ancient Egypt. The vegetables that will accompany tonight's meat course come from the Te Villa's own gardens, where careful irrigation and soil management create growing conditions that approach optimal standards for ancient Egyptian agriculture. Yet these plants still absorb mineral particles through their root systems and accumulate dust and sand on their surfaces throughout their growing cycle. The gardeners who tend these crops employ techniques passed down through generations of service to wealthy households, understanding how to maximize yield and quality while working within the constraints imposed by environmental conditions that affect all plant growth in the desert kingdom. The preparation of these vegetables for elite consumption involves washing and cleaning procedures that go far beyond what ordinary households can afford. With multiple rinses in precious clean water and careful removal of surface contamination that reduces but cannot eliminate the mineral content that has become integrated with plant tissues during growth. The servants who perform this preparation work with the attention to detail that wealthy households demand, understanding that their efforts will be judged not only by the immediate satisfaction of diners, but also by the social standing that culinary excellence brings to their employers. The seasonings and flavorings that will transform tonight's basic ingredients into a memorable feast include imported spices and exotic ingredients that speak of trade networks stretching across the known world. Yet even these precious additions carry their own burden of contamination, from the grinding and processing methods required to prepare them for use. The pepper and cinnamon and other exotic spices that grace elite tables have been ground in stone implements and transported in conditions that ensure their integration with dust and sand, creating flavor profiles that are simultaneously exotic and fundamentally Egyptian in their gritty undertones. The serving vessels that will present tonight's feast represent the finest achievements of Egyptian pottery and metalworking crafts, with gold and silver implements that provide surfaces smooth enough to minimize additional contamination, while creating the visual splendor that elite dining demands. Yet even these precious serving pieces cannot prevent the transfer of mineral particles from food to mouth, serving instead as refined delivery systems for the same fundamental challenge that affects all Egyptian consumption. The servants who maintain these vessels understand their care as requiring both practical skill and artistic sensibility, polishing and cleaning with techniques that preserve their beauty while accepting the inevitable accumulation of residue from the foods they serve. The evening meal at Amenemhet's villa unfolds with a ceremonial precision that marks all significant social occasions among the Egyptian elite. Yet, beneath the surface refinements of golden cups and linen napkins, the fundamental realities of desert dining assert themselves with the inevitability of geological time. The guests who recline on cushioned couches arranged around low tables of polished cedar would represent the pinnacle of Egyptian society, their bodies adorned with jewelry and fine linens that speak of wealth and privilege. Yet, their teeth, when they smile in a flickering lamplight, show the same characteristic wear patterns that mark every adult mouth in this kingdom of sand and stone. The bread that begins the feast emerges from elite ovens as perfect golden discs, their surfaces unmarked by obvious contamination, and their texture refined to a degree that approaches modern standards of bakery craft. Yet the first bite reveals the persistent reality that wealth cannot overcome the fundamental environmental conditions that shape all food preparation in ancient Egypt. The grinding sensation that accompanies each mouthful is subtle but unmistakable, a reminder that even the finest flour produced by the most skilled bakers still carries within it the geological signature of granite grinding stones and desert sand. The conversation that accompanies this opening course flows with the practiced ease of individuals accustomed to social dining, touching on topics that range from court politics to building projects to the eternal Egyptian preoccupation with the Nile's annual flood. Yet, beneath these elevated discussions runs an undercurrent of shared understanding about the realities of eating that need never be spoken aloud. Each guest chews carefully and deliberately, their jaw movements reflecting the lifetime of adaptation that allows refined individuals to process challenging food while maintaining the appearance of effortless consumption. The beer that accompanies the bread represents the finest achievement of ancient Egyptian brewing technology, its consistency approaching that of modern beverages, and its flavor enhanced by careful selection of ingredients and precise control of fermentation conditions. Yet it still carries the characteristic cloudiness that speaks of suspended particles too fine to be removed by available filtration methods. The golden cups that contain this precious liquid create the illusion of purity through their lustrous surfaces, but the liquid they hold retains the fundamental texture that links elite consumption to the basic realities of stone-ground grain and sand-contaminated ingredients. The servants who attend this feast move with the silent efficiency that marks well-trained household staff, their movements choreographed to provide seamless service while remaining as invisible as possible to the guests they serve. Yet these same servants, when they return to their own quarters to consume their own meals, will eat bread made from coarser flour and drink beer with higher concentrations of suspended solids, creating a hierarchy of food quality that nevertheless shares the fundamental characteristic of mineral contamination across all social levels. That the meat course that follows represents luxury beyond the imagination of common workers, with tender cuts of beef that have been roasted slowly over carefully tended fires and seasoned with imported spices that speak of trade networks spanning a known world. The preparation techniques employed for this centerpiece dish go far beyond simple cooking to include marinating processes designed to enhance flavor while softening textures that might otherwise challenge even elite teeth. Yet, despite these refinements, the meat still carries traces of sand and grit that have been introduced during butchering and preparation processes that cannot be completely isolated from the dusty environment of Egyptian food handling. The vegetables that accompany the meat course showcase the achievements of elite gardening and the careful selection of produce that meets the demanding standards of wealthy households, with onions and leeks that have been cleaned and prepared with meticulous attention to quality control. The irrigation water that nourished these plants during their growth carried the same burden of dissolved minerals and suspended particles that affects all Egyptian agriculture, ensuring that even the finest vegetables retain chemical signatures that speak of their sandy origins. The serving implements used for this course represent the pinnacle of ancient metalworking craftsmanship, with gold and silver utensils that provide smooth surfaces for food transfer while creating the visual magnificence that elite dining demands. These precious tools offer some protection against additional contamination during the serving process, their non-porous surfaces preventing the absorption of food particles that might contribute to future contamination. Yet they cannot eliminate the mineral content that has become integrated with the food itself during earlier stages of preparation and processing. The wine that accompanies the meat course represents perhaps the most exotic element of the feast, imported from distant lands where different growing conditions and processing methods create beverages that approach true purity by ancient Egyptian standards. Yet even these foreign luxuries must be transported through the dusty roads and sandy ports of Egypt, ensuring that they acquired their own burden of local contamination during the journey from their places of origin to the tables of Egyptian nobility. The conversation during this portion of the meal turns to matters of greater substance, with discussions of administrative challenges and political developments that affect the kingdom's prosperity and stability. Yet these weighty topics are punctuated by the same careful chewing and deliberate swallowing that characterizes all Egyptian dining. The guests at this refined table have learned to integrate the physical demands of eating with the social requirements of conversation, creating a seamless performance that masks the constant negotiation between nourishment and dental preservation that governs all consumption in their world. The final course of the feast features delicacies that push the boundaries of ancient Egyptian culinary achievement, with honey-sweetened pastries and dried fruits that represent the transformation of basic ingredients into something approaching luxury confection. The honey that provides sweetness for these treats comes from carefully tended apiaries, where bees work among flowers that have themselves been nourished by sandy soil and gritty irrigation water, ensuring that even this natural sweetener carries traces of the mineral environment that shapes all Egyptian food production. The preparation of these final delicacies requires techniques that go beyond basic cooking to include complex processes of grinding, mixing, and shaping that multiply the opportunities for contamination, while creating the refined textures and flavors that mark elite cuisine. The servants who create these masterpieces understand their craft as requiring both technical precision and artistic vision, transforming humble ingredients into presentations worthy of important social occasions, while accepting the environmental limitations that affect all food preparation in their desert kingdom. The conclusion of the feast brings with it dissatisfied conversation and gentle social interaction that mark successful elite gatherings, with guests reclining on their cushioned couches and savoring the final tastes of an exceptional meal, while servants clear away the evidence of consumption with quiet efficiency. Yet even this moment of refined pleasure carries within it the persistent awareness of the physical realities that have accompanied every bite, the grinding sensation that speaks of stone particles and sand grains working their slow destruction on teeth that must last a lifetime. The departure of guests from Amenemhet's villa takes place under stars that shine with desert clarity, above a landscape where wind carries sand through every opening and deposits it on every surface, ensuring that tomorrow's meals will begin their preparation. The same fundamental challenges that have shaped tonight's feast. The servants who remain to complete the cleaning process understand their work as requiring constant vigilance against the accumulation of dust and grit that threatens to contaminate future food preparation. Yet they know that their efforts can only minimize rather than eliminate the environmental conditions that affect all aspects of Egyptian life. Comparison between this elite feast and the simple meals consumed by common workers reveals differences of degree rather than kind, with refined preparation techniques and higher quality ingredients creating more pleasant dining experiences without fundamentally altering the basic challenge of consuming food that carries significant mineral contamination. The social distinctions that separate classes in Egyptian society are real and important, but they operate within environmental constraints that ensure a shared experience of gritty consumption across all levels of the social hierarchy. In the final analysis of Egyptian dietary hierarchy, we discover that the desert environment which shaped this ancient civilization possessed a democratic quality that transcended human attempts at social stratification, ensuring that even the divine pharaoh, seated upon his golden throne and served by armies of devoted attendants, could not escape the fundamental reality that all food grown in sandy soil and processed with stone implements would exact its toll from royal teeth just as surely as from those of the humblest field worker. The mummies of pharaohs, when examined by modern archaeologists, reveal dental wear patterns that differ only in degree from those found in common burial grounds, speaking to the universal nature of the Egyptian dietary challenge. The palace kitchens of Ramesses II, staffed by hundreds of skilled cooks and equipped with the finest grinding stones that royal craftsmen could create, represented the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian culinary technology. Yet even these magnificent facilities could not overcome the basic physics of stone grinding that introduced mineral particles into every product they created. The royal bread that emerged from these kitchens was sifted through the finest linen screens and baked in ovens tended by master craftsmen. Yet it still carried within its refined texture the geological signature that marked all Egyptian food production. The pharaoh's daily meals, planned by nutritionists and prepared by culinary artists whose skills represented generations of accumulated knowledge, included delicacies imported from across the known world and ingredients selected for their exceptional quality. Yet the foundation of royal nutrition remained the same: emmer, wheat, and barley that sustained common workers, ground by the same basic methods that had characterized Egyptian agriculture since the earliest dynasties. The gold vessels that served royal food provided no protection against the mineral contamination that had been integrated with ingredients during their preparation, serving instead as magnificent delivery systems for the same fundamental dietary challenges that affected every Egyptian meal. The royal physicians who attended the pharaoh's health understood the relationship between diet and dental deterioration, prescribing treatments and preventive measures that represented the best medical knowledge available in the ancient world. Yet they could not address the environmental causes of tooth or that resulted from the basic technologies of food production. The medical papyri that survived from pharaonic Egypt contained detailed descriptions of dental problems and proposed remedies, revealing a sophisticated understanding of oral pathology that was nevertheless powerless to prevent the slow, grinding destruction that accompanied every royal meal. The contrast between royal dining and common sustenance was real and meaningful, with palace meals featuring refined presentations and exotic ingredients that created genuine differences in dining pleasure and nutritional quality. Yet these distinctions operated within environmental constraints that ensured fundamental similarities in the basic challenge of consuming stone-contaminated food. The pharaoh's teeth, protected by the finest dental care that ancient medicine could provide, nevertheless showed the characteristic wear patterns that marked all Egyptian mouths, decayed, their royal enamel no more resistant to abrasion than that of common workers. The servants who prepared and served royal meals understood their privileged position in Egyptian society, while simultaneously experiencing the democratic effects of their shared dietary environment. Their own teeth bearing the same evidence of mineral contamination that affected their royal master. The hierarchy of food quality that distinguished palace cuisine from common fare created real differences in taste and presentation without eliminating the fundamental abrasiveness that characterized all Egyptian food production. The archaeological examination of royal burial sites has revealed food offerings that were intended to sustain pharaohs through their eternal afterlife. Yet even these carefully prepared provisions show evidence of the mineral contamination that marked all Egyptian cuisine. The bread, beer, other foods placed in royal tombs were created using the same stone grinding methods that characterized all food preparation in ancient Egypt, ensuring that even divine rulers would continue to encounter gritty sustenance in whatever realm awaited them beyond death. The records of royal banquets that survive in temple inscriptions and administrative documents describe elaborate feasts, featuring dozens of courses and hundreds of guests. Yet, the underlying reality of these magnificent occasions involved the same careful chewing and deliberate consumption that characterized all Egyptian dining. The courtiers who attended these royal gatherings learned to maintain dignified behavior while managing the physical challenges, eating food that tested their dental endurance with every bite. The comparison between royal and common dietary experiences reveals the limits of human technology in overcoming environmental constraints that affect entire civilizations, demonstrating how even unlimited wealth and absolute political power cannot completely transcend the basic conditions that shape food production in challenging environments. The pharaohs of Egypt wielded power that extended across vast territories and influenced the lives of millions of subjects. Yet, they could not escape the simple reality that grinding grain with stone tools produces flour, contaminated with stone particles. The medical understanding of dental, or that developed in ancient Egypt, recognized the universal nature of tooth destruction, while lacking the technological means to address its fundamental causes, creating a medical tradition that focused on treating symptoms rather than preventing the environmental factors that created dental problems. The physicians who served royal households possessed the same basic knowledge about oral health that was available to common healers, their elevated status reflecting social position rather than superior medical capabilities. The democratic nature of dental destruction in ancient Egypt extended beyond individual health to affect the fundamental character of Egyptian civilization, creating a shared experience of physical challenge that transcended social boundaries and contributed to cultural characteristics that emphasized endurance and adaptation. The stoic acceptance of physical hardship that marked Egyptian culture reflected not philosophical choice but practical necessity, as survival in their environment required accommodation to conditions that could not be completely overcome through human effort. The dietary innovations that emerged from royal kitchens represented attempts to minimize rather than eliminate the challenges of consuming stone-contaminated food, with cooking techniques that softened textures and preparation methods that reduced the most obvious signs of mineral contamination while accepting its fundamental presence. These culinary advances eventually spread beyond palace walls to influence food preparation throughout Egyptian society, creating gradual improvements in dietary quality that nevertheless operated within the unchanging constraints of their technological and environmental limitations. The religious significance attached to food in Egyptian culture reflected the understanding that eating was both blessing and burden, with ceremonial meals that acknowledged the life-giving properties of grain while implicitly recognizing the physical costs that accompanied all nourishment. The gods who presided over Egyptian harvests and food preparation were honored not only for their gifts of abundance, but also for their role in sustaining human life despite the challenges that made survival a daily struggle requiring divine assistance. The long-term perspective that characterized Egyptian civilization reflected the understanding that dental wear and other consequences of their dietary environment were not temporary problems to be solved, but permanent conditions to be managed throughout individual lifetimes and across generations. The architectural achievements and artistic masterpieces that defined Egyptian culture were created by people whose teeth showed the universal signs of abrasive consumption. Their magnificent accomplishments emerging from communities that shared the common experience of grinding their way through challenging meals. Ultimate legacy of Egyptian dietary culture lies not in its specific techniques or particular foods, but in its demonstration of human adaptability and the capacity of civilizations to flourish despite environmental challenges that impose significant costs on individual health and comfort. The pyramids and temples that still dot the Egyptian landscape stand as monuments to the achievements of people who accepted the daily grinding of stone against tooth as a necessary price for survival. In their chosen homeland, the modern study of ancient Egyptian diet and health provides perspective on contemporary discussions about food, quality, and dietary choice, revealing how recent technological advances have created options that were simply unavailable to previous generations of human beings. The refined foods and dental care that modern populations take for granted represent revolutionary departures from conditions that characterized human nutrition for thousands of years, including the sophisticated civilization that flourished along the Nile. The lessons embedded in Egyptian dietary history extend beyond academic interest to offer insights about human resilience and the relationship between technological capability and quality of life, demonstrating how environmental constraints can shape entire civilizations while simultaneously inspiring the innovations that eventually transcend those limitations. The grinding reality of ancient Egyptian meals provides context for understanding both the achievements of past societies and the advantages of contemporary food production, technologies that have eliminated many of the challenges that once affected all human nutrition. The democratic nature of dust and sand in ancient Egypt created a shared foundation of experience that united pharaoh and peasant in the common struggle for survival. Their different social positions creating variations in comfort and luxury while leaving unchanged the fundamental environmental conditions that shaped all aspects of life along the banks of the eternal Nile. In this kingdom, where every meal was seasoned with stone dust and every bite carried the promise of slow dental destruction, the greatest achievements of human civilization emerged from communities bound together by their shared accommodation to conditions that tested the limits of human endurance while inspiring the magnificent cultural legacy that continues to captivate the modern imagination.